We're now into week 3 of Poultry PPE. How do societies and economies interact? Competing approaches to political economy. And we're going to look this week at Marxian political economy. Here we have an image of a girl pulling a coal tub in a mine in Britain. And it would have been sometime during the 19th century. Let's try to intuitively access the very different ways in which the problem was conceptualized by the Marxian economists as opposed to the classical political economists. Last week, you might recall that we began our lecture on classical political economy with a sketch of a field being cultivated by rudimentary machinery. You can see that image here again. We see a plough being pushed and pulled by labourers and so forth. And I chose that image to try to demonstrate intuitively the concerns of the classical political economists, who, you might recall, were primarily concerned with the question of how to increase the production of wealth, with a real focus on agricultural production in a primarily agrarian economy. Economies producing grain, wheat, corn. Thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo were formulating their account of the problem as classical political economists in these terms: how to increase production. And their economies were mostly agrarian. This was a period in which the classical political economists had not yet witnessed the changes that were coming, were going to come as part of the Industrial Revolution. They could see some changes coming, but they hadn't witnessed the onset of industrial production. We've got a clue, though, even in the picture that I chose last week, because if you look closely, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of that image, new technology, a steam-powered machine in the bottom corner. So we know that changes are already afoot here in this primarily agrarian economy. So that was the problem that the classical political economists faced. So we need to have people to make that machine, and they need raw materials, labour, and even technology, other technology to make it. So now comes the era of interconnected technology. So I've chosen for you different images to represent the problems that the Marxian political economists were accepting as their own. Our opening image on the first slide for this week was a picture of a child working in a coal mine, pulling coal through narrow passageways to the surface of the earth. So instead of the problem of how to improve agricultural production, political economic thinkers are now facing the problem of how to understand the increasing importance of industrial activity, the production of steam-powered machines, the associated production of ball bearings, metal rods, wheels and other goods, the need for coal to create heat to produce steam to power the machines, the expansion of coal mines, the production of railroads and roads for the transportation of coal and goods by steam-powered trains and cars. We see the emergence of towns in Britain's north. We see the urban population growing and being able to be sustained at rapid rates beyond what Thomas Robert Malthus had predicted under agrarian conditions. We looked at his work last week, remember? But we also saw new forms of impoverishment. And this is the social problem that Marx and Engels accepted as their own. And so we have a different set of images to represent that. We've got an image of a coal mine, the pit mouth at Oaks Colliery, a coal mine here. We've also got a picture of a family increasingly tasked with looking after children and the aged with very little assistance other than a family wage for the man. So these are the problems that Marx and Engels will accept as their own. Impoverishment of the working classes as economies change from agrarian to increasingly industrial economies. We'll see the effects of a division of labour in industry, not in agriculture anymore, but in industry. And we'll focus here on Marx and Engels because their account of production takes an entirely different focus to that of the classical political economists. And it's primarily due to the developments of the Industrial Revolution in Britain in the 19th century, which followed on from the classical period, in which Adam Smith, David Ricardo and Thomas Robert Malthus, the economists that you read from last week, really had not fully anticipated. They hadn't expected to see such massive developments of industrial production. They'd primarily written in an agrarian context. So having started intuitively in that way with the images of the different social problems that our economists will be accepting as their own this week, we can now turn to remind ourselves of the approach that we'll take to this material and map out what we'll do in the lecture. So we're going to take the same approach every week. We're going to look first at the problem as the economists conceptualized it. We're going to look at the response. How did the economists, the political economists, respond to that problem? What theories did they develop? What methodologies did they use? And then we're going to apply a critical lens. In each case, we're going to ask who gains, who loses, does it matter? So we'll see when we deal with the problem that now it's all about the rising social ills accompanying Britain's Industrial Revolution. What is the root cause of the misery of the working class and how might it be overcome? The question is how to organise production so that everyone can develop their distinctly human qualities. And again, note how this is different to the problem that the classical political economists accepted as their own. They were interested in how to increase agricultural and very nascent forms of industrial production in the context of mercantile institutions that they felt were inefficient and only promoting certain interests, and also in the context of institutions that were really remnants of feudalism. So the problem is quite different for the Marxian political economists. The response of the Marxian political economists, Marx and Engels, for example, is to provide a theory to explain misery as caused by the structure of capitalism. And this will involve an account of how, an argument that we should view this as caused by capitalists appropriating the surplus value of a worker's labour. So this will involve a theory of value, a labour theory of value, and it'll involve a theory of capitalism as the alienation of labour. It'll involve a theory of the evolution of communism from capitalism through the revolution of the working classes to create more just societies. Again, note how different this is to classical political economy that we studied last week. This is not laissez-faire economic liberalism. It's not letting the economy be to do as it does. This is not a conviction that population should be left to self-regulate within the bounds of production, as Thomas Robert Malthus advocated. This is a very different view. In part 3, we'll turn again to a critical consideration because Marxian political economy was, in focusing on certain problems and not others, also overlooked certain problems that we might reasonably have expected Marx and Engels to be concerned with. We'll ask who gains, who loses, and does it matter? So last week we noticed that the classical political economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Robert Malthus were primarily interested in how to improve production, increase gross national product and gross domestic product in a primarily agrarian economy, in which there was very large scope for interference by interest groups, both by the merchant class, as feudal economies broke down, and by the landowning class, the remnants of feudalism, who still had inordinate power in government to design policies that were in their own self-interests. To provide an example from last week, we saw how David Ricardo was concerned that landowners were benefiting enormously by tariffs on the importation of grains from other countries. Landowners wanted these tariffs in a context where people were starving, because landowners wanted to be able to open up new tracts of land, secure rent, and benefit themselves individually by trying to produce more corn, more grain, more wheat. Now, David Ricardo rejects this idea and he says, well, it's the landowners that are benefiting here. If we got rid of the tariffs on the importation of grain, like Adam Smith wanted to have, freer markets, then what we would see is those countries elsewhere who have a comparative advantage in the production of grain, producing grain efficiently, and we would also then see the British economy investing in the production of those things that it has a comparative advantage in producing. And we saw that really this became a condition for the ability of the British economy to move towards industrialisation. No longer did it need to focus on agrarian production, but it could increasingly switch its attention to producing other goods that other countries were not producing. So, by focusing on the problem of agrarian production in Britain and the interests of merchants and landowners in having tariffs on trade, and by arguing against those tariffs in favour of a freer market, the classical political economists laid the groundwork for the development of industry in Britain. They did not see this occur, though. They did not see this development occur. Marx and Engels write at a time in which these developments have occurred. We've seen the Industrial Revolution commence. We've seen fantastic rates of profit for emerging capitalists. On this point, we note that the merchant class, which had previously been securing raw materials and paying workers to produce goods in a putting out system, now takes a different form. This merchant class now becomes the capitalist class in an industrial economy. They are now the ones who own the new machinery, the factories, the textiles, the sewing machines, the looms, the machines for weaving, the hand looms, and so on. The spinning jenny that would ultimately replace the hand looms. The capitalists, previously the merchants, now owned the means of production. And so we saw fantastic rates of profit during this time for these emerging capitalists, following innovation in cotton and the production of raw cotton into textiles, and in other areas too. We saw as families moved from feudal lands to cities, as they moved from rural workshops into factories in the towns, we saw a need for capital infrastructure railways and roads, as I've mentioned, rail, iron and coal, new activities to support cities, new products emerging. The Victorian period has been described as the beginnings of a consumer-oriented society, even though the economists were still very much focused on production and how to improve production. And this will give rise to work at the latter half of the 19th century by Thorsten Veblen on the consumer culture and conspicuous consumption. So along with fantastic rates of profit for emerging capitalists, innovation in technology and capital infrastructure development, we see cultural change. We see style emerging. We see the growth of towns and cities. We see demands for entertainment. We see pubs for workers. We see a rise in alcoholism. And we see a decline in agriculture. At the very same time that we see these benefits emerging, we see rising social ills. And it is these social ills that now become the problem, the new social problem for Marx and Engels and the Marxian political economists. Misery is caused, according to Marxist theory, by the very structure of capitalism itself, which works by appropriating the surplus value of a worker's labour. We'll have to look in a moment at the different theory of value and labour that this involves. If we turn to Polanyi for a retrospective of this period, we can see evocative description of these social ills. And we also find them in Charles Dickens's social problem novels, Hard Times, and Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, North and South, which tracks the emergence of these social ills in the changing economic structure of life. Society for Polanyi had been turned into a veritable abyss of human degradation, with staggering rates of infant mortality, childhood death, early adult mortality through disease and industrial accident, shocking accidents in the factories due to a lack of legislation around occupational health and safety, and a real disregard for the lives of the poor. And these were also accompanied by working class behaviours, which the 19th century writers and thinkers described with consternation as immoral. A purported lack of care of children by factory working mothers. Apparently they cared more for wages than for their children's well-being. At least this was how it was theorised by the neoclassical economists that would come later. There was not so much attention to whether or not working class families actually had to supplement their meagre incomes with extra additional wages to survive. This was presented as the moral fault of families because women working in factories weren't devoting enough attention to their own families. We see a rise of alcoholism by working class men. We see a rise in the purportedly immoral practice of abortion. These were all highly moralised at the time. We see conflicting views on contraception and the promotion of the idea of the virtuous woman who should restrain from sexual relations in order to delay the having of children. Contraception was also viewed as immoral at this time, although there were real pushes to change this. So we really had these terrible, and I say terrible kind of social ills, destitution, alcoholism, early death, high rates of childhood birth and mortality. And overcoming this sort of impoverishment was really important. And this is the social problem that Marx accepts as his own, and Engels too. We also see the slow lingering deaths of 500,000 hand loom weavers who slowly died of starvation during this period as their work was taken over by spinning jennies, the new machines in factories. We see social unrest. We see protests. We see riots on the streets. We see the existing poor laws unable to cope. We see the establishment of workhouses, the Whig Benthamite solution, the 1834 overhaul of the poor laws, where poor people were provided with outdoor relief in the form of charity in the parishes. We see that replaced by the poor relief being provided in institutions, in workhouses. And we see other factors too, the narrowing profit margin after 1815, the lowering of wages, agrarian catastrophe deepened by the corn laws that we spoke of earlier, and child labour. So these are all the whole host of new social ills that occur as a result of Britain's industrial revolution. We'll return to slavery in the colonies at the end because it's not one that Marx and Engels really focus on, but it's certainly very much a social ill associated with the Industrial Revolution. So we can now understand that Marxian political economy emerged out of the acceptance of a social problem of immiserization and social ills under an emerging industrial economy. How did Marx and Engels reply? Well, the response was to view misery as caused by the very structure of capitalism itself, where capitalism was viewed as appropriating the surplus value of a worker's labour. So capitalism is an economic and political system too, where industry is controlled by private property owners. And it's important here in justifying the accumulation of property that will permit people to invest further in additional accumulation. So Marx and Engels think that capitalism will, by its nature, cause misery because it's premised on appropriating what they call the surplus value of a worker's labour. And we'll need to discuss that, what that means in a moment. So the response is also that we need a theory of a just society, which Marx and Engels will theorise in terms of the evolution of communism from capitalism through the revolution of the working classes. So those are really the two key elements, a labour theory of value and of capitalism as skimming off the surplus value of labour, and a theory of capitalism as the alienation of labour and a need to overcome capitalism in a communist economic organisation. What I'd now like to do is refer you to two videos by a philosopher called Abigail Thorn, who has presented a very clear account of these concepts in her YouTube philosophy podcast. I'd like to break up the learning in this way into more easily digestible parts around each of these key elements. There are two videos. The first concerns the key element 1 that I mentioned on the previous slide, the idea of a labour theory of value and of capitalists skimming off surplus value. So I'd like you to stop the recording now and either follow that YouTube link or search in the Google search function for Abigail Thorn, Marx Part 1, Labour and Class Conflict on Philosophy Tube. And your task is to take notes and then write a short paragraph that answers the following question: why is capitalism unavoidably exploitative, according to Marx? And try to use those concepts of value, labour power, surplus value, and working class to help you. Now that you understand Marx's labour theory of value and the idea of capitalism as the appropriation of the surplus value of labour, let's look a little more about why capitalism is described by Marx and Engels as a system that alienates labour. Again, Abigail Thorne has a remarkably clear account here, and I think it's nice to break it up and allow you to access some of those ideas through someone else to provide variety and provide variety into the explanation. You can tell me if it works for you. So again, if you could search for part 2 of Abigail Thorne's explanation of Marxism, and then listen to it and try and write down one short paragraph about why, what is meant by alienation, and why does capitalism, according to Marx and Engels, lead to alienation. I hope you found those 2 videos clear and helpful. I know I did when I saw them myself, and it's great to have a good, clear YouTube channel to be aware of as well. However, there was a concept called historical materialism that Abigail Thorne didn't really deal with. And I think it's worth discussing in this context, because our approach to the material in this subject is to explore the close intersection between ideas and theory and the distinct political, economic and social problems that existed and were perceived to exist by the political economic thinkers. And historical materialism in a way captures this idea of the intersection between ideas and theory and economic, political and social institutions. Historical materialism is just the idea that instead of ideas preceding and affecting our economic life, rather it's our economic life itself and our relationship to the mode of production that influences the ideas that we have, not vice versa. So the 18th century view of the individual, for example, where individuals are somehow separate from society and then produce social relations, acting on the world in a free way so that freedom comes first, if you like. This, Marx and Engels think, is really a mere idea that sustains and justifies ownership by certain people and not others of the means of production. Marx wants to inverse this relationship, and this is where we get these famous ideas of the ideological superstructure and the base of the relations of production. These complicated terms are really just meant to express something, a simple idea, and that simple idea is that the ideas that we have about our world and about ourselves in the world are actually produced by the place that we have in that world, the economic relations, the social and political and economic relations in which we exist. We wouldn't have those ideas about ourselves if we didn't also have a particular material position in our world. We relate to each other through the institutions that regulate our economic life, and we then have ideas about our place only as a function of that structure. For Marx, the ideas that we have about ourselves actually legitimizes those economic relations. So it's not like the 18th century thinkers would say. It's not like we have a natural right to property or a natural right to freedom in ourselves as a condition to the sorts of economic behaviours that we then engage in. Rather, we think we have these natural rights to property, to land. We think we're free because these ideas allow us to justify a certain mode of production in which we already find ourselves. We can't think outside of the structures in which we find ourselves. Marx would say that these ideas emerge because we're seeking to justify existing structures of power in which we already live. So we think of ourselves as free. We think of ourselves as having an inalienable right to property in ourselves and property. We think of ourselves as the sort of entities that John Locke, the philosopher, describe, where we have a right to property in our person and we mix labour with our land to own land and so forth, only because of the economic system in which we live and in which the writers are encouraging us to think about ourselves in particular ways. Marx includes all sorts of ideas. Marx wants to interpret all of our ideas as products of the economic base, if you like, even religion. So for Marx, if we think of ourselves as religious, as made in God's image, and as having property right that's God-given, as Locke argued, Marx instead sees this idea as merely an idea. So he's a really big critic of religious ideas, as well as the key philosophical ideas of the time, which were closely interrelated. These are all ideas for Marx that justify the existing structures of power in which we find ourselves. And that's why he refers to religion as the opium of the people. I'll give you an example. For example, if in Christian thought we, the Christian idea of being humble and living a moral life where salvation is to be found in an everlasting afterlife after death, is for Marx an idea that makes people, workers, more willing to accept injustices, knowing that in humble modes of living, humility, a lack of envy, and so forth, makes them willing to accept these injustices rather than revolt against them. That is how religion becomes for Marx the opium of the masses. So if we look at the picture that I've provided, the economic base would comprise the means of production. Who owns what? So the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, will own the means of production, the spinning jennies, the machines, the railroads, the raw goods coming in. And the proletariat, the working class, will only own the labour that they can sell to the bourgeoisie, to the capitalist class. So they're related to each other by virtue of how they situate themselves in this economic system and what they own as part of the means, what they own. As for the ideological superstructure, we've already spoken about how religion might play a role here. We've spoken about culture and politics, but we could say a little bit more. Marx would go so far as to say that state institutions, legal systems, government, police, and the dissemination of ruling ideas about self and place in society through education and through culture are all part of that ideological superstructure, because it's not really possible to think in isolation of the context in which that thinking occurs. So he wants to say that the theories that we saw of classical political economy by Adam Smith, by Thomas Robert Malthus, and by David Ricardo are also ways of justifying particular relations to production. But we don't really need to organise our societies like this, he says. We could be organising our societies differently, particularly if their economic structures are producing such high degrees of immiserisation and many social ills. So to summarise, the mode of production is how the economy is organised. It comprises forces of production, like raw materials, capital goods, labour power and technology. It includes relations of production, how people are organised in classes or hierarchies of networked groups. It also, above the economic base, comprises the social and ideological superstructure, state institutions, legal system, government, police, and the dissemination of ruling ideas, education, religion. Marx saw the economic base as shaping the way society is organised, the superstructure. Now it's more often seen as a two-way or reflexive interaction. Social relations of production are also conceptualised as underpinning the price of commodities for Marx. The key social relations include relations between capitalists and workers, between capitalists themselves, and between workers. The class relations between capitalists and workers are most important for Marx and Engels. Note how Frantz Fanon will shift Marx's focus away from the relations between classes of capitalists and workers and towards other groups in a context of French colonised Algeria. For Frantz Fanon, a reinterpretation of Marx in a colonised context means prioritising the relationship, the problematic relationship between the coloniser and the colonised, or empire and the colonised, where these entities are now the focal points for exploitation and for the skimming off of the surplus value of labour. So the surplus value of the labour of the colonised is for Frantz Fanon the key element of a capitalist system. And for Fanon, it's the empire and the colonised that exploit, closely linked with the capitalist. Let me now turn to your Heilbronner text in your readings, which articulates Marx's idea in terms of a cyclical account of the circuit of capital. Since economists love to represent these processes using symbols, we'll attempt to do justice to the way in which this cycle tends to be depicted by economists. But let's just use simple English to talk about these symbols. So you've got money, M. Money is itself capital. And in this case, we see that money has been put to use in the purchase of capital in the form of commodities. We've got two types of commodities that this capital takes. We've got labour power. Money is being put to use to purchase labour power, and this is the labour of the workers. The labour is the only commodity that the workers have, the only commodity they have to sell. They have no other commodity apart from their labour. So labour power here is the commodity that the worker sells. And then there's also the means of production as a commodity. The means of production are those physical capital goods like spinning jennies, raw materials like cotton and textiles. And then we've got the production process, where the commodities, labour power, and the means of production are put to use to produce capital in the form of commodities, the outputs of the production process. But this is C1 because it's now the outputs of the use of C through production. We've got M1 too, which is capital in the form of money, because the produced commodities, C1, are now going to be sold for money. And this money is then going to be reinvested in capital in the form of commodities, again including labour power and the means of production. And so this cycle goes on. It's an endless repeating cycle, and it permits capital to get bigger and bigger over time. But it only permits capital to get bigger and bigger over time thanks to the skimming off of the surplus labour of the worker in this process. The cycle begins and ends with money. So what is meant exactly by surplus value? In Marx's system, as the video by Abigail Thorne very clearly explained, surplus value is that skimming off of labour. For example, if you only need really to work 4 hours to sustain yourself, to provide for your means of subsistence, then the additional labour that you do for your boss is surplus value. And this is then taken by the employer effectively by paying you less per hour than you should have received for the hours you worked, so that you have to work more. They sell the product that you make. They could have paid you more, but they don't. And they keep profits beyond the amount that they should have taken had they paid you the work that you, the value of your work. So in this way, surplus value is what the capital extracts, the difference between the cost of producing and the sale price. On the previous slide, this would be the difference between M, money, and M1, the money that is received from selling the finished commodity. The difference comes in essence from underpaying labour. The first part of each day, the workers make enough to cover their wages, which is what they have to live, and the rest of the day they make surplus value. Exploitation for Marx is the difference between the value of what a worker produces and what they are paid. This is a technical definition. It's not the same thing as the common use of the word exploitation. For Marx, there are 3 methods to increase surplus value, and all of these are at the expense of workers. Since capitalists are aiming to maximise profit, they use these 3 methods to promote that. The first is immiserisation, cutting wages. The second is absolute surplus value, the lengthening of the working day or the adding of a night shift. And then there's relative surplus value, reducing the time needed to pay wages by transforming the production process with new technology like spinning jennies, new management techniques like workplace division of labour or scientific management, or speeding up the production process. So sticking with Heilbronner, how does Marx help to explain the boom and bust cycles of capitalism? Well, Heilbronner argues that there are 3 main factors that explain the potential for capitalist boom to become disrupted. And these are really endemic to capitalism. We should expect these to continually occur in a kind of cyclical pattern. So the first is the increasing price of labour and raw materials. The idea is that when money becomes increasingly transformed into labour, power and goods, the price of labour and materials tends to rise. So the price of labour gets bid up, and this raises the price of any other commodities whose supply cannot be quickly increased, or whose supply can only be increased at a higher cost. So boom jacks up costs, but rising costs in turn squeeze business incomes. And as the pressure against profit mounts, enthusiasm gives way to growing unease, and we come into a period of recession because a lack of confidence can lead to recession. The second factor is what Heilbronner calls the lurking indiscipline of the labour process. In extended periods of prosperity, it becomes harder than ever to discipline labour. And this is because industrial labour requires an extraordinary amount of discipline. And it's not really the sort of labour that people want to be doing. When labour is divided, as we saw Adam Smith point out last week, when they do very small repetitive tasks to make pins, boredom can set in and people can find that work unsatisfactory. So the worker under capitalism becomes impoverished, whether wages are high or low. In times of prosperity, the bargaining position and economic security of working people improves. And so they become less willing to be disciplined as they were previously required to be in order to earn their living. And finally, there are problems linked to the conversion of commodities into money, according to Heilbronner. So when production is strong and there's lots and lots of productive output, you can eventually get to the point where production gluts the market. We've seen that businesses have sometimes used rather controversial strategies to cut back, such as destroying clothing by a fashion brand and destroying it so that the remainder can be sold at higher prices. We've seen this in the fashion industry from time to time. And that's because an economy that's enjoyed a boom may then find that they need to rearrange production to suit changing patterns of demand. And this means that there are always going to be then pockets of unused labour when this occurs, linked to centres of depression. And since these three factors are unable to be removed from the capitalist economic system, we can expect disruptions. So there will be periodic crises of a cyclical nature in capitalism, argues Heilbronner, using Marx's framework. Note again how this explanatory scheme and the problem itself is very different to the classical political economists that we looked at last week. We're not talking about the interests of the mercantile class or the remnant feudal structures that allowed landowners to have to pursue their interests at the expense of agrarian workers. We're talking about a different problem. We're talking about the problem of surplus value being skimmed off the workers' labour in an increasingly industrial economy. And the solution is different. The solution is not laissez-faire economic liberalism or opening markets up, freeing them from trade tariffs, from tariff imports and from subsidies to domestic industries. That's not the solution. That was the solution for the classical economists, classical political economists, but Marx and Engels are interested in a different solution. They want to explain how capitalist production itself, if left to its own devices, cannot regulate itself automatically to boost economic production, as the laissez-faire classical economists thought. And this suggests a need to respond to some of those problems that result from the cyclical phases of boom and bust, and to prevent the social effects of bust, the impoverishment and the social ills, mass starvation and so forth, that had been clearly visible in those early industrialising economies that Marx and Engels were concerned with. Now to close and to lay the groundwork for a consideration of other competing approaches to political economy in weeks to come, particularly feminist economics and ecological economics, as well as some attention to colonialism and imperialism in the institutionalist part of the unit. In this part 3 of the lecture, we now turn to critical consideration. We've looked at the problem, we've looked at the response, and now we apply a critical lens. Applying Stilwell's questions to theory development itself. Who gains? Who loses? Does it matter? Who gains here with the Marxist approach? Well, it's been said by a number of critics that Marx's approach was pretty blind to the role of women in the economy. Marx and Engels tended to view female labour at home as unproductive. It was not a commodity that could be bought or sold. So unless women's labour was employed in factories where it was compensated by a wage, then it was viewed as unproductive from a Marxist account, Marxian approach. And there was also a real lack of attention to colonialism and imperialism. Frantz Fanon and others, a multitude of others, will try to revisit Marxist categories and look to whether or not a fundamental category of exploitation can be seen in the relationship between empire and colony, and not capitalist and worker, where the capitalist and the worker are really only a subset of a broader exploitative relationship between colonised and coloniser, colonised and empire. Also, the environment is still viewed in this Marxist approach as a resource to be used and not as a limitation or constraint. And this leads to a lack of recognition of the need to use economic theory to respond to the problem of climate catastrophe. So making sense of these issues, which are different issues to the ones that Marx was facing, will really lead us to open the door to other accounts of political economy. We'll need to reconceptualize the social problem that we want to assume as our own. And that's what we'll be looking at in later weeks when we turn to feminist political economy, institutionalist political economy, ecological political economy. So this is not to say that Marxian theory should be rejected out of hand, but it is just to say that the production of theory by Marx and Engels was also in its own historical context and inevitably blind to other problems that they did not accept as their own at that point in time. Other theorists have attempted to find creative ways to use Marx's insights. A French continental philosophy and social theory like the work of Althusser and interpolation. I won't go into these, but I'm just mentioning these in case you've come across them in other units that you've studied in philosophy. Jesse, your tutor in the subject, is also doing his PhD on a German sociologist and philosopher on the philosophy of money. And Simmel too, George Simmel, the philosopher that Jesse's studying, also had a theory about how money had both productive power to create opportunities for us in our lives, while also limiting opportunities in other ways. German social theory, the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, for example, heavily rely on Marx in the development of the idea of false consciousness, why it is that workers consent to their exploitation. They expand the notion of alienation to show that alienation can lead workers to engage in behaviour that really is not very healthy for themselves, even if they conceptualise it as freely chosen. Habermas, too, has a view of distorted communication as ideological. And Axel Honneth is concerned with the phenomenon of ideological recognition, where we seek and want forms of recognition that help us give ourselves value, but may actually not be that positive, where the idea of a mother, for example, has historically been associated with a lack of material recompense for the value of being a mother. Frantz Fanon and others have attempted to revisit Marx through the lens of the relation between coloniser and colonised. So it can be used and employed in different ways, even in order to try to make sense of some of those oversights that we mentioned on the previous slide. Marxian feminism too, has also tried as a subset of feminism to look at women's work through the lens of it being unrewarded productive labour and not merely unproductive labour. And that seems fairly obvious, even though it was overlooked by classical Marxists and neoclassical economists for centuries. So those are some ways that Marxian political economy could be extended to some of the problems that Marx and Engels themselves did not consider. And I think we'll leave it there. Jessie will see you on Tuesday morning for your tutorial. And don't forget to do your first quiz on the required readings for this week. This is due on Monday the 12th by 11:59. So to sum up, I hope you now have a clearer sense of the very different social problem that Marx and Engels assumed as their own, and how this grew out of emerging industrialisation and the impacts on society that this had already caused, how theories of labour and its value were quite different, and allowed one to theorise capitalism as the exploitation of the value of the labour of the worker, the skimming of surplus value, and then also what sort of oversights existed too at this time. So that we can see that theory is not produced in a vacuum, but requires ongoing critical thinking to respond to new oppressions or oppressions that have been overlooked. And that's our objective in this unit, to trace how theories emerge in response to the problems that the economists perceived as being important, how those methodologies emerged to respond to those problems and theories about economic life were developed, and what we might want to say more critically about who wins, who benefits, who loses, and why it might matter, why we might need to continue to think about our economic life in an ongoing way as we face new problems or problems that have not yet been adequately responded to. Thank you.